My name is Claire. I'm in my late 30s, a mother, a professional, and for a long time, I was what people like to call easy to be around. Calm, capable, dependable. The kind of woman who remembers birthdays without writing them down, who notices when the sink is full before anyone asks, who keeps things moving so no one else has to stop and think. Most people who meet me don't see anything dramatic. They see someone steady, quiet, helpful. If I disappear into the background, it's often read as humility or grace. If I don't complain, it's assumed I don't mind. I've learned that when a woman carries herself without noise, the world often fills that silence with its own assumptions. This story isn't about a sudden betrayal or a single explosive moment. It's about something slower, heavier, and much more common. It's about the moment I realized that my husband's entire family didn't see me as a partner, or even as a person with choices, but as an unpaid maid, wrapped in the polite language of being a good wife. What they praised as devotion gradually revealed itself as endless labor, zero respect, and a role I was never allowed to refuse. I want to be clear about what this story is and what it isn't. This is not a revenge story. There are no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no grand speeches where everyone suddenly understands how wrong they were. There is no villain monologue and no instant justice. What there is, instead, is honesty, quiet decisions, and a slow psychological reversal that only becomes obvious once it's already complete. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through how these expectations formed, how they were normalized, and how I participated in my own erasure without realizing it. I'll talk about the small moments most people dismiss, the comments said with a smile, the assumptions made without asking, the way gratitude slowly disappears when your effort becomes expected. And I'll share how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become something very different from submission. This is a documentary style account of emotional labor, power dynamics, and what happens when a woman stops explaining herself and starts observing instead. There is no bitterness in the telling, only clarity. Because clarity, I've learned, is far more unsettling than anger. If you've ever been praised for how much you can tamil, how much you can carry without complaint, this story may feel familiar. And before we go any further, I want to ask you gently, have you ever wondered whether the role you're being thanked for is one you ever truly agreed to? To my husband's family, I wasn't introduced so much as I was absorbed. At first, it felt like warmth. Sunday dinners, where my name was said with a smile, compliments about how easy I was, how I fit in, how lucky my husband was to have someone so capable. Those words landed softly back then. I thought they meant I was welcome. What I didn't notice, because no one points this out to you, was how quickly my presence became functional. I was the one who noticed when the table needed setting before anyone asked. The one who stood up instinctively when the plates were empty. The one who remembered that his father didn't like onions, that his sister preferred almond milk, that his mother got anxious when things felt disorganized. These weren't requests. They were assumptions that formed quietly, like condensation on glass. At gatherings, conversations flowed around me while my hands stayed busy. Someone would ask, "Do you need help?" Already halfway through a story, not waiting for the answer. And I would smile and say, "I'm fine," because at that point, I believed that was just who I was: helpful, low maintenance, good. No one ever said, Claire, you're responsible for this. They didn't have to. The expectation lived in the way people stayed seated when I stood, in the way my absence from the room went unnoticed. My absence from a task did not. If something wasn't done, the silence pointed toward me. They described me using words that sounded kind but felt increasingly narrow. She's so reliable. She doesn't make a fuss. She just knows what needs to be done. These weren't descriptions of my character. They were descriptions of my usefulness. And I played the part well. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. When plans were made, that affected my time, my energy, my weekends. They were spoken aloud as conclusions, not questions. We'll do it at our place. Claire can help with that. You're good at this kind of thing. Each sentence landed with a soft thud of inevitability. What struck me later was how invisible the labor itself became. Meals appeared. Houses reset themselves after visits. Birthdays were remembered. Tensions were smoothed over. And because everything ran seamlessly, it reinforced the belief that nothing had cost anything. My husband didn't see it either. Not fully. To him, I was supportive, easy, a partner who didn't mind. He took my calm at face value and never thought to ask what it took to maintain it. When his family praised him for having such a good wife, he smiled with pride, as if my efforts were an extension of his good fortune rather than my conscious choices. In their eyes, I wasn't someone who decided to help. I was someone who was helped. There's a particular loneliness in being liked for what you provide rather than who you are. It doesn't sting at first. It settles. It becomes background noise. You tell yourself this is what adulthood looks like. This is what family looks like. This is what love looks like when it's steady and mature. I didn't feel mistreated. That's important to say. I felt expected, counted on in a way that left no room for refusal. The praise came bundled with obligation. If I ever hesitated, the room would tilt slightly, as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement. And so I learned to move efficiently, to anticipate, to smooth things before they wrinkled. I learned that my value in that family system was measured by how little space I took up while holding everything together. I don't tell you this with anger, only precision. Because understanding how you are seen is the first step to understanding how you are used. At the time, I still believed this role was earned, that being indispensable meant being loved. I hadn't yet seen the quiet trade I had made, my autonomy for their comfort. That realization came later. But this was who I was to them then: the dependable constant, the invisible axis, the woman who never needed asking. And that perception, once formed, is very hard to undo. The first time it happened, it was so small that I almost missed it. We were at my in-laws' house for a weekend visit. Nothing unusual. Familiar driveway, familiar routines. I arrived already scanning the space the way I always did. What needed wiping? What needed arranging? What would make the visit smoother for everyone? That habit was so ingrained, it felt like breathing. Dinner was halfway through when my mother-in-law stood up and said casually, Claire, could you grab more bread from the kitchen? Not could you, in the way someone asks. More like a line in a script. She assumed I already knew. I stood up automatically. But halfway to the kitchen, I noticed something that stopped me, just for a second. My husband was closer. His brother was closer. Anyone else at the table could have reached the bread more easily than I could. And yet, the request had come to me. That pause lasted less than a breath. I kept walking, brought back the bread, sat down, smiled. No one noticed the interruption because, to them, nothing had changed. But something had shifted inside me. Later that evening, as dishes piled in the sink, my mother in law laughed and said, "You're so good at this, I don't even have to ask." She meant it as praise. Everyone smiled. My husband squeezed my shoulder in agreement. I laughed too, because that's what you do when something makes you uncomfortable, but you can't yet explain why. That was the first small cut. It wasn't the request itself, it was the assumption beneath it that my role was to respond, not to choose, that my proximity didn't matter, that my time was always available, always flexible, always less important than everyone else's comfort. Over the next few weeks, I replayed that moment in my head more times than I care to admit. Not obsessively, quietly, like turning a smooth stone over in your pocket. I tried to reason with it. She didn't mean anything by it. It's just a habit. You're good at helping. This is what families do. But once you notice the pattern, it's hard to unsee it. The next time it was, "Claire will know where that is." Then, "Just ask Claire. She handles that." Then, "You don't mind, right?" That last one was said with a smile. It was framed as a question, but it didn't feel like one. There was no pause for my answer, no room for a different response. And each time I complied. Part of me was afraid of being seen as difficult. Another part was afraid of breaking something invisible but fragile. The image of harmony I had worked so hard to maintain. I told myself I was choosing kindness. I told myself this wasn't worth addressing. What I didn't understand yet was that silence, when repeated, becomes a confirmation. Everyone else ignored these moments because they were convenient, because nothing seemed wrong, because I wasn't angry, because the system worked for them. The cut wasn't deep enough to bleed, but it left a mark. I started noticing how rarely anyone checked in with me, how often plans were made around me, not with me, how gratitude appeared as a blanket statement rather than a specific acknowledgement. "We couldn't do this without you," said vaguely after everything was already done. It's strange how being appreciated can still feel like being erased. That night, lying next to my husband, I considered telling him, just mentioning it lightly, testing the ground. But the words felt too heavy for how small the incident seemed. I didn't want to sound petty. I didn't want to turn something nice into a problem. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, something important began to form. Not anger, not resentment, but awareness. That first small cut didn't hurt much, but it taught me where the blade was. Once you've felt the cut, even a shallow one, your body remembers where it came from. I didn't confront anyone after that weekend. Life moved on, as it always does. Work deadlines, school schedules, another family gathering penciled into the calendar. On the surface, nothing had changed. But internally, I began doing something new. I started noticing. And what I noticed most was repetition. The same assumptions, dressed in slightly different language. The same pattern of requests that weren't really requests. The same easy confidence with which my time and energy were volunteered by other people. It was subtle enough that If I had tried to explain it to an outsider, I might have sounded overly sensitive. So instead, I explained it to myself. They don't mean it like that. You're just more capable. It's easier if you do it. This is what being part of a family looks like. That last one became my favorite excuse. At gatherings, I found myself standing while others stayed seated. If there was a lull, my eyes would instinctively scan for what needed attention, even before anyone spoke. Sometimes, someone would say, "You don't have to do that," while watching me do it anyway. The contradiction never seemed to bother them. When I hesitated, even briefly, there was a shift in the room. Not disapproval exactly, more like confusion, as if a dependable appliance had stopped working and no one understood why. Someone else would step in awkwardly and the moment would pass. But later, I'd feel the quiet pressure to return to normal. Normally, I was learning, which meant predictable. My husband still didn't see it. Or perhaps he saw it but didn't question it, because questioning it would have required him to see how much of my effort benefited him too. When his family leaned on me, it made things easier for him. When I smoothed over tensions, he didn't have to navigate them. When I took on the invisible work, he got to remain the agreeable son, the relaxed brother, the easygoing husband. And I didn't blame him, not yet. I had taught everyone how to treat me by never asking to be treated differently. That realization was uncomfortable. I started noticing how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. Not in a dramatic sense, just small things. Where I'd like to eat, whether a weekend plan worked for me, if I were tired, if I needed help. These questions weren't withheld out of cruelty. They simply didn't occur to anyone anymore. My role had been defined by usefulness, not preference. The most disorienting part was how reasonable it all seemed when taken individually. One request here, one assumption there, one comment framed as a compliment. Nothing outrageous enough to protest, nothing sharp enough to point to. That's how normalization works. Not by force, but by accumulation. I told myself I was choosing peace, that staying quiet was maturity, that speaking up would only create unnecessary tension. I prided myself on being emotionally intelligent, on understanding other people's needs, on not making everything about me. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, my inner voice began to shrink. I stopped checking in with myself before saying yes. I stopped pausing long enough to ask whether I wanted to do the thing being expected of me. My body moved before my mind had a chance to object. And the family, his family, grew more comfortable, more relaxed, more confident that things would simply be handled. That comfort came at a cost, even if no one acknowledged it. There were moments, late at night, when I felt an unnamed heaviness settle in my chest. A quiet resentment I didn't want to own because it didn't match the narrative of gratitude I was supposed to feel. I told myself I was being dramatic, ungrateful, unfair. After all, no one was yelling, no one was insulting me, no one was telling me I had to do anything. They didn't have to. The system worked because I cooperated with it. Because I mistook accommodation for kindness, endurance for virtue, and silence for strength. What I didn't realize then was that every time I normalized a small disrespect, I was lowering the threshold for the next one, teaching everyone, including myself, that this was acceptable. By the time I sensed something was wrong, it already felt too embedded to name. And that's the danger of quiet erosion. You don't notice the ground giving way until you look back and realize how far you've drifted from where you started. It wasn't announced. There was no meeting, no explicit agreement, no moment where someone said, "This is who you are now." The role was assigned the way these things usually are, through repetition, reward, and quiet correction. By the time I recognized it, I was already deep inside it. In my husband's family, there were clear archetypes. His mother was the emotional center, opinionated, expressive, allowed to be tired, and occasionally difficult. His father was disengaged in a way that was forgiven as age or temperament. His siblings rotated between competence and chaos, depending on the season of their lives. And then there was I. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who didn't need checking on. If something needed organizing, I did it. If someone needed support, I provided it. If there was tension in the room, I absorbed it and redirected the energy so others didn't have to feel uncomfortable. I wasn't loud enough to disrupt, emotional enough to worry about, or fragile enough to protect. That was my role: useful, calm, invisible. What struck me later was how little flexibility there was once that role was solidified. The moment I deviated, even slightly, the system resisted. When I once said I was too tired to help clean up after a long day, there was an awkward pause. Someone else eventually stepped in, but the air shifted. The rhythm was off. Later, I overheard a comment said lightly, "Claire must be exhausted today." Not concerned, an explanation. A justification for why the machine hadn't functioned as expected. It was clear then, my compliance wasn't just appreciated, it was required. Being a good wife in this context meant being endlessly available without being demanding. It meant anticipating needs before they were voiced and fulfilling them without expecting recognition. It meant smoothing over other people's shortcomings while minimizing my own needs so thoroughly they barely registered. And the most effective part of the role? It came with praise. They thanked me constantly for being organized, for being thoughtful, for being so low maintenance. They compared me favorably to other women in the family, which made me uncomfortable but also subtly reinforced the behavior. Approval became the leash I didn't realize I was wearing. No one asked whether I wanted this role. They didn't have to. I had accepted it every time I stayed quiet, every time I said yes without pausing, every time I told myself it wasn't worth the discomfort of saying no. My husband benefited from this role more than anyone. With me handling the emotional labor of his family, he never had to choose sides, set boundaries, or disappoint anyone. He trusted me to manage it because I always had. When I tried to explain my exhaustion once, just a hint of it, he was confused. "But you're so good at it," he said, genuinely. "I thought you liked helping." That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was honest. I realized then that I had become indistinguishable from the role I played. My preferences, my limits, my interior life, all of it had been quietly edited out of the family narrative. I was not seen as someone who helped. I was seen as someone who handled things. And systems don't ask tools how they feel. The role was never written down, but it was enforced through expectation and silence. If I fulfilled it, things stayed smooth. If I didn't, friction appeared. Not confrontation, just subtle disappointment, confusion, the sense that I was letting people down. So I kept playing my part. But somewhere beneath that calm surface, a different awareness was forming. Not rage, not grief, something colder and clearer. I was beginning to understand that this role wasn't temporary. It wasn't situational. It was structural. And once a structure is built around your labor, removing yourself from it changes everything. That understanding didn't make me act right away. It didn't make me loud or defiant. It did something much quieter. It made me start paying attention to how much of myself I had never been allowed to withhold. The day something shifted didn't look like a turning point from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic walkout. It was an ordinary afternoon, so ordinary that for a long time I dismissed it as insignificant. But in hindsight, that's what made it unmistakable. The shift didn't announce itself, it settled. We were hosting a family gathering at our home. I had spent the morning preparing in the way I always did, cleaning surfaces no one would consciously notice, planning food that accommodated everyone's preferences, and arranging the space so nothing felt chaotic. By the time the first car pulled into the driveway, I was already tired. At some point during the visit, I realized I hadn't sat down once. Not fully. Not without getting up again moments later. I stood at the counter while others lounged on the couch. I moved between rooms, refilling glasses, answering questions, and solving small problems before they became visible. And then from the living room, I heard my sister-in-law say, "Claire's so good at this. She makes it look effortless." There it was again, that word, effortless. Something inside me went very still. I remember looking down at my hands. They were slightly shaky, not from anger, but from exhaustion. I felt a strange disconnect between how I was being perceived and what I was actually experiencing. The gap between those two things had grown so wide that it finally became impossible to ignore. I wasn't effortless. I was depleted. For the first time, instead of pushing that thought away, I let it finish forming. I let myself acknowledge how much work it took to maintain this image of calm competence. How much of my energy had been quietly redirected away from myself and toward everyone else's comfort. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel furious. I felt clear. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The same table where I had served, cleared, wiped, and reset without a second thought. I noticed how silent it was without people needing something from me. And in that silence, a realization landed with a kind of weight I had never felt before. If I stopped doing this, everything would fall apart. And if everything fell apart without me, then someone had been benefiting from my invisibility. That was the moment the story I had been telling myself changed. I had believed I was choosing this role, that I could step out of it anytime. But that evening, I understood that the choice had been slowly taken away, not by force, but by expectation. By how long I had gone without being asked what I wanted. I thought about all the times I had said yes when I meant maybe. All the times I had preemptively managed situations to avoid discomfort that wasn't mine. All the ways I had minimized my own fatigue because no one else seemed to notice it. And I asked myself a question I had never seriously considered before. What would happen if I didn't explain myself anymore? Not in a punitive way, not to prove a point. Just what if I stopped offering my labor as a default? The answer scared me, not because of what might happen to them, but because of what it would require of me. It would mean tolerating disappointment, letting people feel uncomfortable, allowing the image of me they relied on to fracture. That night, my husband came into the kitchen and thanked me, absent mindedly, for everything today. I nodded. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him how tired I was. I didn't list what everything actually entailed. I realized then that explanation had become part of the labor. So I stopped. That decision wasn't loud. It didn't change anything immediately. But it marked the end of my unexamined compliance. From that moment on, my silence was no longer automatic. It was deliberate. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being a weakness. After that day, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't sit my husband down for a serious conversation or confront his family with a list of grievances. Outwardly, I looked the same. I smiled. I showed up. I spoke politely. Nothing about my demeanor suggested rebellion. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. Before, my silence had come from habit, an automatic smoothing over, an instinct to keep things easy. Now, it came from restraint, from observation, from choosing not to fill every gap. I began to notice how often I used to speak for others, anticipating needs, answering questions before they were asked, offering solutions before problems had time to surface. So I stopped on doing that. Not abruptly, just enough to see what would happen if I didn't intervene. At first, nothing did. Conversations stalled. Someone would look around the room, waiting for direction. A small logistical question would hang unanswered for a few seconds longer than usual. I stayed seated. I stayed quiet. I let the pause exist. People filled it eventually. What surprised me was how uncomfortable those pauses made everyone else. They were used to the machinery running smoothly. When it didn't, they fidgeted, laughed nervously, stepped in clumsily. And still, no one asked me why I had changed. They mistook my silence for fatigue, for distraction, for a bad day, anything but intention. That misinterpretation gave me space. I stopped volunteering information about my schedule. I answered questions directly without adding context or cushioning. When someone said, "You don't mind, right?" I didn't rush to reassure them. I paused long enough to consider whether I actually didn't mind. Sometimes I said yes, but it was a real yes, and sometimes I said no, calmly, without apology or explanation. The first few times I did that, the room reacted strangely. Not with anger, but with surprise, as if I had spoken in a different language. "Oh, okay," someone would say, adjusting quickly. And that was it. No argument, no collapse. That was an important data point. I had spent years believing that refusal would cause damage, that it would hurt people, disrupt relationships, unravel the fragile peace I had been maintaining. But what I saw instead was something much simpler. People adjusted when they had to. They just preferred not to if someone else would do the work. My husband noticed the change before his family did. He asked me one evening if everything was all right. His tone was neutral, but there was an undercurrent of confusion. Things weren't breaking, but they weren't running as smoothly either. "I'm fine," I said. And for the first time in a long while, it was true. He didn't press, I didn't elaborate. That restraint was new for both of us. I stopped over-functioning in private too. I didn't remind him of things he could remember himself. I didn't manage his family obligations on his behalf. If something slipped through the cracks, I let it, not out of spite, out of accuracy. What became clear very quickly was how much my previous silence had hidden, not just my exhaustion, but other people's dependence on it. Without my constant adjustment, the imbalance became visible. And still, no one named it. They continued to praise me when I did help. They continued to assume when I didn't push back. But now, I could feel the difference between being helpful and being obligated. That awareness gave me leverage, not in the manipulative sense, but in the psychological one. I was no longer acting from a place of fear. I was choosing where to place my energy. Silence, I learned, can be a mirror. When you stop explaining, people reveal what they've been taking for granted. And what they revealed, slowly and without realizing it, was how much of their comfort rested on my unspoken labor. I didn't need to confront them yet. I didn't need to correct the narrative. I just needed to keep watching. What they never noticed wasn't the change in my behavior. It was everything that change made visible. From the outside, I was still present, still polite, still involved enough to avoid suspicion. I hadn't withdrawn dramatically or announced new boundaries. I simply stopped compensating. And because I had been compensating for so long, the absence of that effort created gaps no one knew how to name. Those gaps became my education. I began paying attention to patterns I had once been too busy to see. Who spoke first when a decision needed to be made? Who waited? Who assumed someone else would handle the follow through? I noticed how often my name used to be inserted into plans without my presence in the conversation, and how awkward things became when I wasn't there to absorb that assumption. I also started documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. Dates, requests, the exact language people used when they framed expectations as favors. I wrote down how often I was thanked in vague terms versus how rarely anyone acknowledged specifics. I noted how quickly people adjusted when I declined, and how quickly they forgot the decline once time passed. That notebook I always carried wasn't a diary. It was a record, and records have a way of cutting through self-doubt. At the same time, I began quietly strengthening parts of my life that had nothing to do with my husband's family. I reviewed finances I had once trusted others to manage. I updated the documents. I learned exactly where I stood legally, practically, and independently. Not because I was planning anything drastic, but because knowledge restores proportion. The more I learned, the calmer I became. They mistook that calm for compliance. At gatherings, when something wasn't done, someone else would eventually step in, often clumsily, sometimes resentfully. I watched how quickly frustration surfaced when the work became visible, how people joked about being bad at this stuff, as if incompetence were a personality trait rather than a habit. No one laughed when I was tired. They didn't notice how often conversations centered on logistics I used to handle silently. They didn't notice how often small tensions went unresolved now that I wasn't smoothing them away. They felt the discomfort, but not its source. And because they didn't trace it back to me, they never thought to ask what had changed. My husband began to feel it too, though he couldn't articulate it. Family visits felt heavier, less seamless. He was more tired afterward. He mentioned once that things felt off. I listened. I didn't explain. Explanation, I had learned, would only invite negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating my humanity. What they truly never noticed was that I had stopped needing their approval. That was the most significant shift of all. Before, praise had functioned as currency. It validated the role I played. Now, I heard it differently. "You're so good at this" sounded less like a compliment and more like an admission of reliance. "We don't know what we'd do without you" sounded less affectionate and more revealing. They weren't expressing gratitude, they were expressing dependence. And dependence, when unacknowledged, breeds entitlement. I also noticed how rarely anyone checked whether I enjoyed what I did. The assumption had always been that capability equaled consent, that if something came easily to me, it must be fulfilling. They never considered that ease was the result of effort, not the absence of it. I stopped correcting that assumption. I let people believe what was convenient for them. Behind the scenes, I continued preparing, not for confrontation, but for alignment. I made sure my life reflected my values, not the expectations others had placed on me. I reduced my emotional investment in dynamics I couldn't control. I strengthened my sense of self outside the role I had been given. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of power began to shift. Not because I demanded anything, but because I stopped offering everything. They never noticed the moment when I became capable of walking away. Not physically, but psychologically. When their approval lost its leverage. When their disappointment no longer felt like a verdict on my worth. By the time they sensed something was different, it was already too late to address it casually. Because awareness, once sharpened, doesn't dull again. And I was no longer unaware. The private reveal didn't come as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time it happened, I already suspected the shape of it. I had felt the imbalance for months, had watched the system strain when I stopped propping it up, had seen how quickly my presence was equated with function rather than relationship. What I didn't yet have was proof, something solid enough to quiet the last traces of self-doubt. That proof came quietly, during an ordinary conversation that wasn't meant to include me at all. We were at another family gathering, one of the smaller ones. Fewer people, less performance. I had stepped into the hallway to take a call, and when I came back, I slowed without meaning to. Voices carried from the kitchen, my mother-in-law and one of my husband's siblings, speaking in the unguarded way people do when they believe they're among their own. "She's just better at that kind of thing," my mother-in-law said. "You can always count on Claire." There was a pause, then a laugh. "Honestly, I don't know how she does it all, but I guess some women are just built for it." Built for it. I stood there longer than I should have. Not because I was hurt, but because the language was so precise it felt almost educational. This wasn't about appreciation. It was about classification. I wasn't someone who chose to help. I was someone who was meant to. In that moment, the last illusion fell away. They weren't unaware of my labor. They were comfortable with it. So comfortable that they had woven it into their understanding of who I was as a person. My effort wasn't something to be protected or shared. It was a resource they assumed would remain available. And if a resource runs out, you replace it. You don't ask how it's feeling. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't step into the kitchen and announce what I had heard. I walked back into the room when the conversation had already shifted, carrying my calm with me like armor. Inside, something settled. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a series of unfortunate habits. It was a belief system, one that cast me as a stabilizing force rather than an autonomous individual, one that justified endless labor as virtue and invisibility as strength. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me decisive. That evening, when I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. They don't see me as someone who can opt out. Seeing it in ink was different. It grounded the thought. It stripped it of emotion and left only structure. From that point on, my questions changed. Not, how do I make this fair? But why am I participating in something that requires my disappearance? I began looking at my marriage with the same clarity, not to assign blame, but to understand dynamics. How often had my husband relied on me to manage his family relationships? How often had he benefited from my silence without realizing the cost? How often had he confused my calm with consent? The answers were uncomfortable, but useful. This was the private reveal. Not just how they saw me, but how thoroughly I had been positioned, how deeply the expectations ran, how little space there was in their minds for me to refuse without disrupting the entire structure. And that meant something important. If I chose myself, it wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be accommodated gently. It would require a change, not a loud change, structural change. I didn't rush that decision. I let it sit. I let it inform how I moved, how I spoke, how I invested my energy. I watched more closely than ever. I measured reactions. I tested small boundaries and noted which ones were ignored, which ones were respected, and which ones were quietly resented. The pattern was consistent. My usefulness was welcome. My autonomy was tolerated only when it didn't inconvenience anyone. That was all I needed to know. The private reveal wasn't about leverage in the traditional sense. It wasn't a secret I could use against them. It was clarity I could use for myself. And clarity, once earned, doesn't ask for permission. It simply changes what you're willing to accept. The decision point didn't arrive as a dramatic ultimatum. It arrived as a quiet sorting of options. Once the private reveal settled into place, I could no longer pretend I didn't understand the system I was in. And understanding has consequences. You can't unknow a pattern. You can't return to innocence once you've seen how something works. I began listing my options, not on paper, but internally. The way you do when you're trying to be honest with yourself. I could keep going as I was. That option was the most familiar. Continue being competent, accommodating, quietly indispensable. Accept the praise as payment. Manage the fatigue privately. Tell myself that this was simply the cost of harmony. Many women live entire lives this way. I knew that. But now that I saw the cost clearly, that option felt less like endurance and more like self-betrayal. I could try to renegotiate the role. This was the option most people would recommend. Have a conversation. Explain my feelings. Ask for more balance. Hope that awareness would lead to change. I considered it carefully. I imagined the discussions, the confusion, the defensiveness disguised as misunderstanding. And I saw the flaw immediately. Renegotiation only works when all parties believe the original agreement was flawed. But there had never been an agreement, only expectations. Expectations they didn't see as burdensome because they weren't carrying them. To them, the system wasn't broken. It was convenient. I could slowly withdraw. This option was tempting. Gradual distance, less involvement, lower emotional investment. It would minimize conflict, but it would also prolong the dynamic. I would still be orbiting a structure that required my labor to function, even if I contributed less of it. And then There was the option I had been avoiding thinking about. I could choose myself without waiting for permission. Not impulsively, not angrily, but decisively. That option didn't mean immediate separation or dramatic confrontation. It meant recentering my life around my own values rather than around maintaining other people's comfort. It meant accepting that choosing myself would disappoint people and that their disappointment was not mine to manage. That option felt irreversible. Once you stop participating in a role built on your invisibility, you can't pretend to be comfortable in it again. Once you act from clarity instead of compliance, there's no going back to being easy. I took my time with that truth. For weeks, I lived at the edge of that decision, testing what it would feel like. I paid attention to how my body reacted when I imagined each path. The first option made me feel tired before I even began. The second made me feel anxious, braced for endless explanation. The third felt frightening, but clean. Clean in the way honesty often is. My husband sensed the distance growing between us. Not emotional distance, but something harder to name. I was still kind, still present, but I was no longer cushioning the world for him. He asked me once if I was unhappy. I'm paying attention, I said. He didn't know what to do with that answer. The decision, when it finally solidified, didn't come with relief. It came with resolve. A quiet understanding that whatever happened next, I would not abandon myself again for the sake of being palatable. I chose the option that respected my dignity, even if it disrupted the narrative others had written for me. I chose the path that required action rather than explanation, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I was done negotiating my worth inside a system that depended on my silence. That choice didn't change anything overnight, but it changed the direction of everything that followed. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it. That was the first and most important part of moving in silence. I stopped seeking validation for what I knew I had to do. There's a misconception that decisive change must be visible to be real, that it needs an audience, a declaration, a moment where you draw a line and wait for reactions. But the kind of change I was making couldn't survive that kind of exposure. Not yet. Explanation would only invite interference. So I became methodical. I started with the practical things, the unglamorous, quietly powerful ones. I reviewed every shared responsibility I had taken on without ever formally agreeing to it. Emotional, logistical, financial. I separated what was truly mine from what I had been carrying by default. I updated passwords. I organized documents. I made sure I understood our finances completely, not just broadly, but in detail. I checked accounts, obligations, and patterns. Knowledge is grounding. It removes the fog that keeps people compliant. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply made sure that if I needed to stand on my own, I could do so without panic. At the same time, I stopped compensating socially. If a family event was so poorly planned, I didn't rescue it. If communication broke down, I didn't step in to translate or soften. I showed up as a participant, not a facilitator. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. People began feeling the effects before they understood the cause. Schedules clashed. Expectations went unmet. Small frustrations accumulated. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to make things uncomfortable. And because I wasn't reacting, wasn't fixing, wasn't explaining, that discomfort had nowhere to go. My husband noticed first. He became more attentive, not out of sudden insight, but because the absence of my constant management made his own experience heavier. He asked more questions. He tried awkwardly to fill in gaps he had never had to see before. I didn't criticize his efforts. I let them be imperfect. That, too, was part of moving in silence. Perfection had been one of the tools that kept me trapped. As long as I did things flawlessly, there was no visible cost to others. By allowing imperfection, by allowing reality to show, I was redistributing responsibility without a single confrontation. There were moments when I was tempted to explain myself. When someone commented, "You seem quieter lately," or "You've been so busy," it would have been easy to turn those into openings, to finally lay everything out. But I resisted because I wasn't seeking understanding. I was seeking alignment. And alignment doesn't come from convincing people. It comes from changing what you participate in. I also began reclaiming time, slowly, deliberately. Time that used to disappear into unspoken obligations. I invested it in things that had nothing to do with being useful. Things that didn't earn praise. Things that were mine alone. The effect was subtle but profound. The less available I became, the more visible the imbalance grew. Not to them, not yet, but to me. I could see clearly now how much of my life had been shaped around preventing inconvenience for others. Moving in silence gave me something I hadn't had in years: momentum without resistance. No one argued with me. No one tried to stop me because they didn't know what I was doing. They only felt that something was no longer being done for them, and they didn't know how to name that loss. And loss, when it's unnamed, creates confusion. That confusion bought me time. Time to solidify my choices. Time to strengthen my footing. Time to prepare for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Because I knew, without doubt, that eventually the absence of my labor would be noticed. And when it was, there would be no going back to the version of me they were comfortable with. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They crept in, disguised as inconvenience. At first, it was small things. Family plans that felt oddly disorganized, meals that ran late, tensions that lingered instead of being smoothed over. No one connected these changes to me, not consciously. They just felt a vague sense that things were more effort than they used to be. And effort, I learned, is what people notice only when they're forced to expend it themselves. My absence from certain roles became noticeable in indirect ways. Someone would sigh and say, "This is usually handled already." Another would comment, "We're a bit behind today." The language stayed passive, impersonal, as if the missing piece might reappear on its own if named vaguely enough. It didn't. When my mother-in-law began calling more frequently, it wasn't to ask how I was. It was to clarify plans, confirm details, and ask questions I used to anticipate before they were ever spoken. Her tone remained polite, but there was an edge of uncertainty there now, like someone adjusting to a tool that no longer worked the way it used to. I answered when it suited me, briefly, accurately, without stepping back into the role. That restraint unsettled her. She began making comments in group settings, half joking, half pointed. "We'll have to figure this out ourselves, I suppose." Laughter followed. Not unkind, but revealing. The expectation was still there. The reliability was not. My husband felt the consequences more directly. Without me managing the emotional undercurrents of his family, he found himself in the middle of situations he had never had to navigate before. Small conflicts that I once diffused quietly now landed in his lap. He was more tired after the visits, more irritable. less sure of his footing. He didn't blame me, not explicitly, but I could feel his confusion, his discomfort at the shift in balance. He asked if we could go back to how things were. I asked him what that meant. He couldn't answer because how things were had depended on my constant, unacknowledged labor. And once that labor was withdrawn, the structure it supported began to sag. His family started expressing concern, not for me, but about me. Is Claire okay? She seems distant. The question wasn't rooted in curiosity, it was diagnostic. They were trying to identify the malfunction. What unsettled me most was how quickly discomfort turned into subtle pressure, not demands, suggestions, nostalgia, reminders of how smoothly things used to run. They spoke of the past as if it were a shared golden age, carefully omitting the cost at which it had been maintained. I listened. I nodded. I didn't correct the narrative. That was their work to do, not mine. The consequences also surfaced in how people treated me individually. Some became more attentive, sensing that something was off. Others grew distant, no longer receiving the benefits they had once enjoyed. The divide was instructive. Those who valued me as a person adjusted. Those who valued me as a function felt deprived. Neither reaction surprised me. I was surprised only by how little it took for the discomfort to escalate. How quickly frustration replaced affection once expectations were no longer met. It confirmed what I had already suspected. My role had been less about love and more about utility. And utility, once interrupted, creates resentment. I stayed calm through it all, not because I was unaffected, but because I understood what was happening. This was the system recalibrating, testing whether my withdrawal was temporary or permanent. They were waiting for me to step back in. I didn't. That refusal, quiet, consistent, unwavering, changed the dynamic more than any argument ever could. It forced others to confront responsibilities they had never claimed. It exposed dependencies they had never acknowledged. And it made one thing very clear. The version of me they preferred only existed as long as I continued to erase myself. That version was gone. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were already behind it. At first, the family's response to my withdrawal had been casual. Small comments, gentle nudges, the assumption that whatever phase this was would pass. When that didn't happen, concern crept in. And when concern didn't restore the old balance, it curdled into something else. Urgency. My mother-in-law began trying harder, inviting me directly into plans again, thanking me more effusively when I did participate, as if volume could substitute for understanding. "We really appreciate everything you do," she'd say, her voice warmer than before, eyes searching my face for reassurance. I smiled. I thanked her, and I did not step back into the role. That was when the tone shifted. Suddenly, there were conversations about family values, about how everyone needed to pull together, about how things felt disconnected lately. The language was careful, communal, almost sentimental, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. Come back, fix this, be who you were. What they never said was, "Why did you stop?" Because asking that question would have required them to hear an answer they weren't prepared for. My husband struggled the most during this phase. He wanted a resolution without disruption. He wanted things to feel easy again without having to re examine the system that had made them easy. He asked if I could just help a little more, if we could find a compromise. I asked him what he thought I had been compromising all these years. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his answer was honest and revealing. He said he hadn't realized how much I had been doing. He said he thought I was okay with it. He said he never meant for me to feel taken for granted. I believed him. Intent wasn't the issue, impact was. By then, his family had begun reacting more openly. Frustration slipped through the politeness. Disappointment was no longer masked as humor. Someone remarked within earshot that things have changed and not for the better. They were right, but not in the way they meant. They tried, briefly, to adjust, to divide tasks, to organize more clearly, to take on responsibilities they had always delegated to me without naming. But the effort felt foreign to them, clumsy, resented. It wasn't sustainable because it was motivated by loss rather than understanding. They wanted the outcome without the accountability. And by the time they realized that my withdrawal wasn't temporary, that I wasn't tired or distracted or quietly sulking, it was already too late to fix things gently. The dynamic had shifted too far. I was no longer invested in restoring what had been. I had seen too clearly what it cost me. There was no appeal to nostalgia that could make me unsee that. What struck me most during this phase was how quickly people framed my change as a problem to be solved, rather than a signal to be understood. Their urgency wasn't about my well being, it was about their discomfort. And discomfort, unlike harm, demands immediate relief. They wanted the relief I used to provide. I stayed steady. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list grievances. I didn't ask for apologies. Because by then, I knew that explanation would only reopen the negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating my presence. The moment had passed when this could be fixed with better communication or clearer expectations. That window had closed quietly, long before anyone noticed it existed. All that remained now were consequences, uncomfortable, unavoidable, and necessary. They felt blindsided, I felt grounded, and that difference mattered. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no accusations hurled across a room, no dramatic ultimatums. It happened on a quiet afternoon, in my living room, with everyone seated and nowhere to perform. That alone changed the tone. My mother in law spoke first. She said she felt distance. She said things felt strained. She said she missed how close we all used to be. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for reassurance, or apology, or explanation. The old version of me would have rushed to smooth the moment, to take responsibility for the discomfort in the room. I didn't. I understand why it feels that way, I said. My voice was steady, neutral, but I don't agree with the framing. That surprised them. I explained, not emotionally, not exhaustively, but clearly. I said that for a long time, I had been operating in a role that required constant availability and labor, without room for refusal. That which had been labeled as being helpful had slowly become an expectation. That I had realized I was being valued more for what I provided than for who I was. No one interrupted me. My husband looked down at his hands. I didn't accuse anyone of intention. I didn't say they had meant to hurt me. I spoke only about patterns, impact, and what I was no longer willing to do. I said I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeking blame. I was simply no longer participating in dynamics that required my invisibility. There was a long silence after that. My sister in law finally said, "We never asked you to do all that." I nodded. "That's true. But you accepted it every time I did. And that's how systems form." That was the moment the air changed. Not defensiveness, recognition. They tried, briefly, to explain themselves, to say they appreciated me, to say they didn't realize. I let them speak. I didn't contradict them. Appreciation wasn't the issue. Structure was. I said one last thing before ending the conversation. "I'm still part of this family, but I'm not available in the same way. And I won't explain or justify that going forward." No one argued, because there was nothing to argue against. I wasn't demanding change from them. I was stating a change in myself. That distinction mattered. The confrontation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. No hugs, no tears, no promises of doing better. Just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted and would not be undone by goodwill alone. After they left, my husband asked if I felt relieved. I considered the question carefully. "I feel aligned," I said. And for the first time, he understood that this wasn't about conflict. It was about integrity. Who I am now is not louder than who I was before. That surprises people. There's an expectation that once a woman steps out of a role like mine, she must become sharper, harder, visibly changed. As if reclaiming yourself requires aggression. As if peace can only come after a storm. But the truth is quieter than that. I'm calmer now. Not because less is asked of me, but because I no longer carry what was never mine to hold. My days have more space in them. Not empty space, but honest space. Time that belongs to me because I chose it, not because it slipped through the cracks of obligation. In my husband's family, the dynamic is different, more defined, less fluid. I am still treated politely, even kindly at times. But the expectation that I will anticipate, absorb, and resolve has faded. Not completely. Habits take time to die. But when those expectations surface now, I meet them with stillness instead of compliance. And stillness is powerful. I don't rush to fill the silence anymore. I don't rescue moments that aren't mine to save. When something needs to be done, I wait to be asked, and even then I decide. The decision is internal, unannounced, final. My relationship with my husband has changed too. Not perfectly, not without friction, but with clarity. He sees me more fully now, not because I demanded it, but because he had to confront what my absence from certain roles revealed. We have conversations we never needed to have before. Some of them are uncomfortable. All of them are honest. I no longer manage his relationships for him. That alone has shifted the balance between us. What's most surprising is how little resentment I carry. I thought for a long time that reclaiming myself would require anger, that I would need it to justify the change. But anger turned out to be unnecessary. Clarity did the work. I don't replay old moments anymore wondering what I should have said. I don't catalog slides. I don't fantasize about being understood. Understanding, I've learned, is optional. Respect is not. And respect begins with what you allow. There are still moments when the old instinct surfaces, when I notice something undone and feel the urge to step in automatically. But now, there's a pause, a breath, a question I ask myself before I move. Do I want to do this? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's no. Both answers are equally valid. I'm no longer praised the way I used to be. fewer compliments about how easy I am, fewer assumptions about my availability. That absence used to frighten me. Now, it feels like confirmation. Because being easy was never the same as being valued. Who I am now is someone who understands the difference between kindness and self erasure, between generosity and obligation, between silence as fear and silence as choice. I didn't leave my life, I simply stepped back into it. And in doing so, I discovered that dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to be defended loudly. It shows up in what you no longer explain, what you no longer tolerate, and what you no longer trade away for approval. This version of me isn't dramatic. She's just finally present. There is a moral to this story, but it isn't the kind that fits neatly into advice or slogans. It's not speak up sooner or set boundaries immediately. Those phrases assume that awareness comes early, that power dynamics are always obvious, that silence is always a failure of courage. They overlook how many roles are entered gently, disguised as love, usefulness, or being needed. The truth is simpler and harder. If a role requires you to disappear in order to be appreciated, it is not love. If your value depends on how much you endure without complaint, it is not respect. If refusal is treated as betrayal, then consent was never part of the arrangement. What I learned is that emotional labor, when unacknowledged, becomes entitlement. And entitlement doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It arrives as comfort, as a habit, as this is just how things are. No one in my story woke up one day intending to use me. They simply adjusted to a system that worked for them. And I participated in that system longer than I should have. Not because I was weak, but because I was taught that being good meant being accommodating, and that discomfort was the price of belonging. But belonging that costs you your autonomy is not belonging, it's quiet erasure. The shift didn't come when I demanded change from others. It came when I stopped negotiating with myself. When I recognized that my silence had been interpreted as agreement, and that I was allowed to withdraw agreement without justification. You don't owe anyone access to your labor just because you've provided it before. You don't owe consistency at the expense of your dignity. You don't owe explanations to systems that benefit from your exhaustion. What changed my life wasn't confrontation, it was alignment. Choosing actions that matched what I knew to be true, even when that choice disrupted familiar comfort. And yes, people were disappointed. Yes, relationships changed. Yes, some doors closed quietly, but the door back to myself opened. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: pay attention to the roles you're praised for. Ask yourself whether the praise would survive if you stopped performing them. Notice who checks on you when you're no longer useful. Notice who adjusts and who resents having to. Those observations will tell you everything you need to know. I didn't win by being louder. I didn't win by being right. I won by no longer agreeing to disappear. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever realized, slowly, quietly, that something you were thanked for was actually something you were trapped in?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.